want to welcome you. I know we're going to start here in just a few minutes, but just welcome you. You are on the right Zoom webinar for Safe Ministry Developing Culture Prevention, and we'll start here in just a few minutes. Actually, it'll be less than a few minutes. It'll probably be here in about 30 seconds. Our goal for this webinar, as you're kind of clicking on, will be with our panel, and we discuss, it'll be right at about 15 minutes. So we'll go from 1 to 1:50, I think is our time. Give you about 20 more seconds as people are clicking on. Okay, I'm going to get this thing started. And I just want to welcome you to Safe Ministry Developing a Culture Prevention within your organization that serves children and youth. As a leader in your organization, each person on this webinar is entrusted with the well-being of children and youth that you oversee. And so this webinar will touch at a high level how to develop a culture of prevention so that children and youth thrive and your organization stays on mission. And so I welcome you. My name is Keehner. I'm the director of Safe Ministry. Safe Ministry's parent corporation is Safe Hiring Solutions. We provide security solutions and training to keep children and youth and organizations safe so you stay on mission. For over 30 years, I've worked as a full-time pastor. The last 25 in the Indianapolis area. I believe I'm the only one on our leadership team without any background in criminal prevention. However, I do know how churches work, how you're just leveraged on volunteers. And so I bring a lot of insight on trying to help churches that are vulnerable to possibly children or youth being hurt within the organization, and just bring insights to our criminal prevention team. I'm excited to introduce our panel of experts today. I'm going to let them give you a little bit of their background. We will start with Joelle. Joelle, do you mind introducing yourself and just sharing your background?
Totally, it's my pleasure. My name is Joelle Casteix, and I live in Southern California in the Orange County area. And I'm here today because I had a mission that was chosen for me. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse from a Catholic high school run by the Diocese of Orange within a faith organization. And through my healing process, I decided that the best way to ensure that this kind of crime doesn't happen to another child is to speak up. So for the past 20 years, I've been a survivor advocate, doing everything from media outreach to writing books to speaking engagements like this. I have a couple podcasts. I've lobbied several state legislatures to change the statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse. And I believe that the things that we can do right now, and the reason that I'm here, is that keeping children safe is very, very easy. It's about education, it's about awareness, and it's about transparency. And your being here is that very first step. So I'm really glad to be here today.
It's never easy to follow Joelle. She is the best. But my name is Shaunestte Terrell. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Cohen and Malad in Indianapolis. Most of my background is in criminal prosecution. For many years, I was the deputy prosecuting attorney, where I focused on crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, and human trafficking. I also served as the expert in the state of Indiana for law enforcement officers and prosecutors. So I traveled around and taught them how best to investigate and prosecute these crimes, and also helped legislators write the bills that were trying to close some of those gaps in the law. We made some progress, but there's still a long way to go. And now I work in civil litigation, where I pursue claims on behalf of survivors of sexual abuse. And I'm here today because I'm completely committed to prevention efforts, and I really do believe that we can prevent this. And I'm hoping that we can put me out of work.
Awesome. Well, I'm Mike McCarty, CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions, Safe Ministry Solutions. My background, grew up in a home. My father was Indiana State Police. My mother was a victim advocate. They thought I was going to law school, and I became a police officer. I spent about 8 years in Nashville, Tennessee, but it took me less than 12 months to figure out that being a police officer in the early 90s was really not what I thought it was going to be. When they asked me when I interviewed, why do you want to be a police officer? I said, I want to help people. And that's what most police officers say. 12 months later, I'm like, man, we don't help anybody. We only respond after something happens. And I reapplied to law school, never made it. 3 years into being a police officer, we looked at some data in Nashville, Tennessee, and we kind of saw some themes that the women and children that were being killed by somebody that claimed to love them, they all had multiple police responses to their house before it had happened. And, you know, I kind of approached our leadership and said, I think we can prevent this. They thought I was crazy. You can't prevent that. It's unpreventable. It's domestic violence. It's a crime of passion, not preventable. Well, the mayor at the time got wind of what we had looked at. We ended up starting what became the largest domestic violence unit in the United States, reduced domestic murder rates by more than 50%. So I know crime prevention works. I've seen it. I've seen it work in the police department. I've seen it work in schools. And so we're just excited to talk a little bit today about just creating that culture. But the first part is just know that it can be prevented. I think you're muted, Don.
Thank you. Y'all are in for a treat. We've got a great panel here to help your organization stay safe and stay on mission. Two things I just want to bring up. If you want to have a good experience and it's not in speaker view, you can do that on your end and put it in speaker view so you can get a full view of our speakers. Also, if you have a question, you can drop that in the chat box, and we have somebody monitoring. The last 10 minutes, we're going to open up for a couple Q&A questions for our panel. Okay. I thought this definition might help our listeners understand what we're trying to help them form and grow within their organization. And that is the word culture. It is defined by words like this: growing, flourishing, behaviors, and attitudes of a particular group. Okay. And so as I give questions out to Mike and Joelle and Shaunestte, Mike, you've been involved in violence prevention for over 30 years as a former violent crime detective and consultant. My question is, doesn't every organization believe they have a culture of prevention?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think if we ask that question every day, we work with schools and youth serving organizations, thousands of churches. I think we all believe that we're committed to preventing crime. But I think as we assess most organizations, very few really do have a true, what I would call, culture of prevention. And how I would use that as a model, I mentioned when I started in Nashville, Tennessee, our police department really felt like that we were preventing crime, but yet in reality, we were only showing up after a crime was committed. You know, you get robbed, we show up. You get shot, we show up. Somebody steals your car, we show up. We never interceded before something happened. We always came in as the cavalry after the impact. And so I can sympathize with organizations because when I became a police officer, not only was I raised in a home with law enforcement, a mother that's a victim advocate, my first experience with child sex abuse, I gave up my bedroom. I came home one day and my parents said, "You're on the couch downstairs." And I was like, "Well, what did I do wrong?" And they had taken in a young girl of 13 years old, somebody I knew, somebody I went to church with. Her dad was a school teacher, but he was sexually abusing her. So I came into law enforcement having some experiences, but yet I didn't understand the dynamics of sexual or domestic violence. So I can appreciate and sympathize with organizations who feel like they're maybe there, but it really takes expertise. You're really going to have to yoke arms with experts. You're going to have to be survivor centric. Everything I learned from survivors, because my view of normal is not the same. What I thought was normal, if I've said this once, I've said this 10,000 times working with professionals, unless you're a survivor or you've been well trained, you need to check your view of normal at the door, because none of this makes sense. It will make no sense to you as you start down this path. So it's easy to assume we do understand or think we have a culture of prevention, when in reality, we may not necessarily have a true culture of prevention. And it really starts with our leadership team, right? I mean, you infuse and really drive how that culture develops and grows. And so, yes, most of us think we have a culture of prevention, but we may not necessarily quite be there yet.
So yeah, this is a good segue to you, Joelle. As Mike said, he's learned everything he has known about some of that prevention on abuse by survivors, and you being one. How did the culture of your private school contribute to what happened to you?
A very smart person I know once told me that in a criminal investigation, the most believable person is the perpetrator. That would be Mike who said that. And that was the culture at the high school I went to, because we had charismatic personalities. We had larger than life people. We had a very, very strong volunteer base, because when you have a volunteer base, these aren't people who are there for the money. They're there for the passion. They're there for the cause. They're there for the faith. They're there for the youth development. And so I went to this high school. It was the star. It still is in many ways in the Diocese of Orange. It was an elite school, and getting in there was a huge honor and pleasure. And then once you were in, you became a part of a culture of protection. And that protection didn't protect the kids, it protected perpetrators. And it went from the hiring to the way that volunteers were brought in, to how we talked about kids, how kids were told to interact with teachers. And so with that culture, what ended up happening is that it became a grooming culture. And grooming, for those of you who don't know, it is the way by which a perpetrator tricks a victim and a community into thinking that the child abuse, either sexual abuse, didn't happen or that it's okay. And so that culture of grooming started things like blurring boundaries, closed doors with teachers and students, private parties with teachers and students, travel events with teachers and students. And then it went on to a culture of secrecy, in that we never did or said anything that could harm the school. And then it became one of retribution, in that if you did speak up, there would be things that would happen to you because you were a bad apple who was hurting the school. Now, I graduated in 1988. That was a long time ago. The school is still in existence, and the school still has a big problem. And in fact, if you're familiar with high school sports, the hazing issue that's going on at that school right now has made national news. That's because the culture of protecting the institution over protecting the child has always been first and foremost. And what needs to happen, and what needs to happen at that school and your church and every youth serving organization, is that needs to be flipped. Our number one priority is the protection and safety of our children.
Thank you. Y'all are segueing perfectly, because I'm going to throw a question out to Shaunestte here. Shaunestte, when survivors hear of attorneys, we've talked about this, they cringe at times, rightfully so, as we look at headlines like at Kanakuk camps on how attorneys for churches and organizations have kind of like been on the side of the brand, right? On making sure that that is protected over the survivor. So give us a little bit about your career fighting for survivors. How is your work as an attorney different?
Well, unfortunately, what we're seeing at Kanakuk is not an extreme example. I think what is in the public right now and what is in the news and what people are actually seeing is something that I see on a regular basis. And I think the knee-jerk reaction for many of the attorneys for churches and other youth serving organizations are dealing with things like this. Knee-jerk reaction is figure out how to mitigate their exposure to litigation and how to protect the integrity of the organization. And they think that by doing that, or by taking the following actions, they do that, and they don't, because what they do is they silence survivors, and then what is obviously a problem turns into a much bigger problem. And in reality, had they already been existing in a culture of prevention, and had they had the proper procedures and policies in place, one, they wouldn't be in the situation in the first place. And two, they know how to handle it in a manner that not only protects survivors, that holds offenders accountable and keeps the organization on mission, which I think is what most people want, and they just don't know how to do it. The sad truth is very few organizations operate in this manner, no matter how good their intentions are. And that's when I get involved. My practice is based around suing perpetrators and negligent parties who have done something or quite possibly not done a lot of things that enable abusers. And they enable those abusers to have access to those kids that they continue to do those things to. And then that's when I come in.
Yeah, in our dialogue and getting to know you, and you had shared with Mike and I that, hey, I don't want to do this job for forever, right? Hopefully your bosses aren't listening on this webinar, but tell us a little bit about what you mean by that.
Oh, I know that might be hard to believe for everybody coming from an attorney, but I actually don't want to sue anyone. I want to live in a world where we don't have to, a world where everyone is thoroughly educated and trained on these issues, the proper protocols and procedures in place, and then they handle it accordingly. And that's why I'm here today. I am 100% always dedicated to protecting children and to making sure that this isn't happening to more children, and in whatever form it takes. And part of that is prevention. At the end of the day, I want it to stop.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, can I add something to that real quick, Dawn? And I think that this is something for everyone on the call to hear. Shaunestte and her role is one of the biggest partners that every organization who's on this call has. No other group has taken the risks to help survivors like the attorneys who represent victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse, many times when those survivors didn't have rights at all. And few people have the kind of interaction with survivors as these attorneys have, and the breadth of knowledge. And so when a survivor's attorney speaks out to you, and this is the kind of person who does, who is actually suing these organizations, they're actually your biggest ally. And I mean, I cannot sing Shaunestte's praises enough. The work she's doing is really God's work.
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
incredibly
Yeah, that's why we have her on our team and on this webinar. Okay, I give an example when I do training of culture, and it hurts me on this example because I grew up in this state, but there's two chicken places that we all know of. One is KFC, and one is Chick-fil-A. And whatever you like about those two institutions, they have two, I think, vastly different cultures. And so they've been created, right? Again, we're talking about what are you creating as a leader, and where's your organization going? Hopefully in protecting kids, but then also allowing kids to thrive and just enjoy life and to have good relationships. And so what are some areas you've seen organizations continually do that do not build a culture of prevention? So Joelle, I'm going to start with you. We can bounce around a little bit, but as you're training and diving into seeing and learning all that you've been involved in, what are a couple of things that you've seen that they continually seem to step on?
Sorry, I kept on mute. Two things. I believe that many organizations struggle with a culture of fear. And fear comes from a lot of different places. Fear of speaking up, fear of causing problems, fear of being ostracized, fear of being excluded from the group. And the more that we can change our culture from one of fear to one of awareness, education, and transparency, the more that we can empower and enable people to speak up when they first get suspicions, speak up when they see something and they know it's not right, speak up when they're like, hey, we don't have the right policies and procedures in place. Hey, I don't like what this person is doing. And if you erase that culture of fear and you empower and create a structure and a foundation for your employees and volunteers to really feel like they can do and say whatever it takes to keep kids safe, that they are empowered, and that there is a culture of transparency to help with that, I think that goes so far. Because the number one reason that people don't speak up is because either A, they didn't know because they weren't given the education and training they needed, or two, they were afraid. And if we erase both of those, you completely change the culture.
Shaunestte, in your line, what have you seen on your end with being in the courtroom? What are you seeing in organizations that continually to do, like not have a culture of prevention?
It's just exactly what Joelle said, really. It seems like rather than having a culture of prevention, there's a culture of silence in many of these. And I'm not talking about just churches, I'm talking about organizations of all kinds. We're all guilty of it. I think as a society in general, this is an uncomfortable topic. And if we can't work through that discomfort to educate each other and educate our kids, unfortunately, it's just going to keep happening. And so as we continue to be quiet, and just like Joelle said, sometimes it's people are scared, or if it's, well, I'm not sure. We hear that a lot. Well, I wasn't for sure, so I'm just going to stay out of it. And it's like, well, if you do that, if you continue to do that, your children will be harmed. They will. Unfortunately, it is reality. And so we have to do a better job of, educating each other in really bringing that culture prevention to life. And when we do that, it will follow with the kids as well. And we can actually affect some positive change, I think.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, to follow along what Joelle and Shaunestte just mentioned, to give an actual live example, one of my friends was a detective for about 30 years on the East Coast. And just to show you the impact and the power of ending silence and actually talking, he was sent to become a child sex abuse detective early in his career. And actually he was like, wow, what did I do wrong? I mean, he had no experience with this whatsoever. He said, my life was transformed on the third day of training when they brought a group of survivors as adults in to speak to us. And he said, I was on fire. He said, I went back to my community and I started talking to every animal group, the moose, the elks, anybody that would let me talk. And he said, what happened is they went home and started talking about this at home, and the children started to hear it. He said, our disclosure rates went through the ceiling. And he said, we couldn't imagine why. And we finally realized we were talking about something we had never talked about before. And now children were coming out and telling us about it. I think the opposite of that is true a lot of times in an organization. Is we too often believe the abuser. Joelle, I think you mentioned this right out of the gate, and it's worth reminding. I tell police officers, social workers, most of the time, the most believable person you'll ever speak with is actually the person that's doing this. And the manipulation, gregarious, the grooming of the community, the things that they're doing inside your church or organization, where people literally look at it and go, I can't believe that person would do that. And so too often, by not understanding, not having been well trained, we oftentimes believe the person who's doing all of this. And so, you've got to really, commit yourself to learning and listening and opening up those lines of communication. And it's just training, good quality training to help lay that foundation of understanding for that culture. You're muted.
We should be professionals at Zoom and be unmute, but I'm trying to. Most of the organizations that are on this webinar, I believe, function with volunteers at like a high 90% are boots on the ground workers. So you may have 1 or 2 employees and 20 volunteers. That's how most organizations, especially churches, work. Okay. And they come in for a time being. Before we get there, okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of things in the sense of, hey, what are you seeing? What are 2 key areas that a church or organization can start doing that promote a culture of prevention? Okay, so before we get there, do you going back to the culture that's not being one of prevention, are there any terms that you continually hear? I've got one that I always hear of like, hey, no, we're good. We know everybody, right? Is there anything else that you kind of say, hey, I'm running into this on a regular basis, these phrases that promote a culture that said, hey, I don't think you're going far enough and kids aren't protected here?
Well, one of the big ones is, well, that kid has a lot of problems and is looking for attention. Or this guy is so great. People are just trying to tear him down. People have a vendetta against him. Or oh my gosh, this person has been a member of the church for 5 million years. He's had kids at his home swimming in the pool every day since he got here. He would never do something like that. Or we are in the faith-based organization. That's a sin. We would never do that. It's like beyond their comprehension. It's incongruent with their way of thinking that something that horrible could happen. But you see victim blaming, you see predator supporting, and you see complete and utter denial.
Eli Molina is on one of our trainings he's a forensic interviewer, and Mike and I were talking with him, and he's had over 1,200. He's bilingual in the state of Texas, one of the leaders. He's had over 1,200 interviews of kids that have been sexually abused. 1,200. And so Mike and I were talking. We said, how many have recanted? And he said 1. So it reiterates and strengthens that kids aren't making this up. Yes, they are the victim, but they shouldn't be blamed, and they're not making this up. And we've got to do things before to prevent this, but then while we've got to then do some things that help them so we don't cause more trauma to them if that goes to that point within your organization. But the question I want to get back to is give those listening 1 or 2 key points. I want them to be able to take away from this, what they must establish for their organization to strive in building a culture of prevention. Because we have some that probably have a pretty strong culture of prevention within the organization. And then we have some that are just beginning, right? Going, man, you know what? We do know everybody, or we thought we knew everybody here, and that's not probably where we should start. So Joelle, you want to jump in?
Well, I really think that if you come from a survivor-centric view, and so if you have an organization where there has been abuse in the past, or where there is a problem of abuse in other similar organizations, I highly recommend bringing in survivors to speak. And there are a lot of survivors organizations out there. I'm always available as well, who can talk about our particular experience and how it might apply to your particular organization. And what that does is exactly what Mike was explaining. It opens your eyes and it makes things that maybe you didn't even realize were a problem. Like, oh my God, I didn't even know. And what it does also is it creates a safe space for survivors in that audience, even if they have not been abused in your organization. It creates a safe space for them to come forward. And when you create a safe space for survivors, you create a safe space for everybody.
Thank you.
I would say this is hard just 2 things. That's always difficult because there are so many things.
I'll give you 3 or 4.
Oh, okay. One thing I would say, 2 truths that you have to understand and face before you're able to be effective is, one, there's a false dichotomy that many people buy into, that if this person did all these wonderful things, he couldn't have also done this. And that's just not true. He can have done both things. He may have, established the best food drive ever in the history of the organization. He may have done all of these wonderful things for your organization, and he still did this. And that is something that people have a really hard time coming to terms with. And the other thing I would say in terms of a key truth is that if you're not with the children, the survivors, and protecting them, you're with the perpetrators. And that's a tough pill to swallow, because everyone's like, listen, no, I'm not. But you are. If you're not there for them, if you're not doing right by them, the only person you're helping is the offender.
Yeah, that's a tougher one to swallow, right? Because we're here, everybody on this webinar is here to protect children, right? So Mike, you got anything that you've seen just
Yeah, I follow the same kind of, it's been mentioned once, but it's worth mentioning again, like Eli Molina said, 1 recant out of 1,200. I mean, survivors don't lie. There was a study years ago in Portland, Oregon, and they were looking at this, right? Because there was such a belief system within the criminal justice system that many survivors of sexual and domestic violence false report. And so they did this study in Portland, Oregon, and what they found was they had a higher false report rate in Portland for somebody saying their car was stolen and it wasn't stolen than a survivor of abuse. And so it really puts into perspective. Our problem here is not false reporting. Our problem is non-reporting. We learned very quickly in Nashville, when we started the specialized unit in Nashville, we had maybe 20% of survivors that had enough trust that they would actually tell us what was happening. 80% either had a bad experience and they're never going to talk to us again, or they just did not trust the system enough. So it holds true within your church community as well. You can't help people heal unless they tell you they need help. And so you're dealing with a huge population that's not telling anybody about this. And so the culture speaks to them in behavioral ways. We also need to speak to them from the pulpit. We need to make it clear, because every single Sunday, you have survivors sitting in your church, whether you believe it or not. And I 100% agree with Shaunestte. If you take a passive approach to this, you are actually on the side with the abuser. I mean, you're aiding them in everything they're trying to do. You're complicit in this just by the fact that you're doing nothing. And so, when I look at Nashville after 2 or 3 years in this program, when we're now getting 50 and 60% of our survivors reaching out for help, what we encountered was a homicide rate that went from, on average, 25 women and children a year reduced to less than 12. That's still 12 people, but that was a 60% reduction. And it was all about trust in the system, reaching out for help, and doing it early enough before it escalated to a really dangerous level. So really just believe and create that culture that really represents what you believe and how you believe.
As we're discussing this and the organization is listening, there's kind of 3 areas that I'm going to have you all maybe speak into. One of those, you can grab hold of one, okay, that really help an organization stay safe and start building that culture. What policies? Okay, so if there's a policy, like I've got a couple of go-to policies, I'm like, you've got to have this policy. Okay, if not, you've got to. And what I try to help organizations do is then tweak their policy and make it better, right? Depending on how your culture functions or how your organization. So you got policy, you got training, and then because of the organization is so heavily dependent on volunteers, is how you vet them, right? How you bring them into your organization in a manner that they understand what you're about. Okay, do you rush them in? So with those 3 things, policies, training, volunteer vetting, if one of you 3 want to speak into any of those, you can. Okay, I'm going, hey, this is a policy that you must have, or this volunteer vetting tip I'm going to give you, okay, type deal. So for me, when I deal with an organization that is going, I don't know where our culture is, I ask them, I'm like, have you even surveyed if kids can be isolated when they come into with an adult or an older youth, or is there any time that they can be isolated alone with them? Like, have you even monitored that? Like, do you have somebody and a volunteer say, hey, can you just watch for 2 hours to make sure no child is ever isolated? And so are you like measuring up to that? That's something that's important, because we know if a child gets isolated with an older adult or adult and an older youth, there's some things that could happen and they're going to push towards isolation. That's what they're trying to do, right? Either on campus or off campus in that realm. So that's kind of where I'm going. I'm throwing a question that I didn't prep you all on, but y'all will adjust really well. And then in mine also is just that there are some understanding that a perpetrator that comes in that wants to do harm, they're very hard to catch in the act, but you will find them pushing policy. And are your policies memorable? Like, do people know them, right? So I'm going to stop there. Anything from that you would like to speak into? Policy, training, volunteer vetting.
I'll start and I'll even wind it back a little bit, because I think that most organizations haven't even sat down and had a roundtable to say, what is our culture? What do we need to do? Because when you said, well, are we monitoring? Are we seeing that kids aren't isolated? So on and so forth. A lot of organizations aren't even there yet. And so it's really taking your stakeholders, and your stakeholders aren't just the staff, and they aren't just the parents, and they aren't just the kids, and they aren't just the volunteers. It's bringing everybody in together and starting that conversation and making that conversation safe. And then saying, you know, what are our needs? Then you bring in the experts. And then you know, they parse things out very, very well and do the assessments and everything else. But you know, I always dial back, you got to start with the conversation, because there are some organizations that have excellent policies, i.e. the Boy Scouts. However, they don't follow their policies. So the best policies in the world are completely ineffective if they're not followed. So if you bring in the stakeholders, you get the buy-in, and you get everyone understanding that not only do we have to have policies, we have to follow the policies and understand the policies and tell people about the policies. Then you use the culture to move on and create what you need.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Mike or Shaunestte, you want to add any to that on policies, training, volunteer vetting?
Mike, do you want to go, and I'll take us into the home stretch on that one.
Perfect. You know, I would say from a vetting perspective, I think, you know, probably the thing that we've seen for the last 18 years, when I started Safe Hiring, we do background checks. Really, background checks for churches is still a lot like the Wild West. A lot of cheap stuff, a lot of background checks that really aren't going to help you. They're inexpensive, but they're also, it's a net that's casted wide that's not bringing in very much. I also have to let you know that about 80% of sex offenders don't have a criminal history. So if your only mechanism in the vetting process to prevent allowing somebody into your organization that could harm a child is a criminal background check, the best one in the world is not going to work 80% of the time. Reference checks, and too often what we see, and unfortunately in the world we live in right now, where we have a million jobs, everybody's looking for employees, everybody's looking for volunteers. We've just, you know, the pandemic has decimated a lot of our volunteers who may not be coming back, or they're not coming back to church live. And so as we rush to backfill these positions, what we've seen cyclically over the years in these environments, the first thing we quit doing is talking to references. And it's probably the biggest mistake we can make. And I'm not talking about, we call the 2 or 3 that they give us. There are ways of doing this. We have a software called RefLink that can do this anonymously, but you've got to gather information, talk to the organizations. How often we see somebody bounce from one group to another group to another group, and you're not even talking to the groups that they just left, where there were red flags, or there were smoke, there were signals, there were signs that we should have seen had we just done some reference checks. So, you know, making sure a full application, the background checks, the reference checks, the interviews, you know, I think we heard, you know, we were talking about, well, we know them. Well, the truth of the matter is most sex offenders know the people they're harming. Stranger danger. I've got 2 daughters. Sure, we talk about the boogeyman a little bit, but I talk a lot more about people they know, because I know my daughters are much more likely to be hurt by somebody they know than by somebody they don't know. And so just, you know, making sure we do exhausting recruiting and vetting before we allow somebody to have access, and then continuous vetting, you know, as they work within our organization.
I would piggyback on what Mike is saying with the importance of the background checks and the reference checks, and, you know, point out especially that not every background check is created equally. I have a case right now where we have a huge international corporation that ran I'm using the air quotes, background check on an individual that they hired, who they were placing in people's homes to help take care of developmentally disabled people. And what did this background check miss? Pending child molesting charges. He had a pending case 1 county over, and it supposedly didn't show up on this background check. And unfortunately, it might not have, because as I said, they're not all created equally. And so they hired him anyway. And what did he do? He sexually assaulted a severely disabled person in a horrific manner. And now that company is dealing with the consequences of that, both, you know, in terms of how they feel, but also in terms of their pocketbook. And Mike's right about the reference checks too. They're super important. And just as Mike said, you have to remember that historically, the vast majority of kids don't tell ever. And if they do eventually tell, the average age of disclosure is 52. And what does that mean? That means that these offenders often don't have a criminal background. There are serious gaps in the law in terms of reporting misconduct, and we're working on that. But until then, people continue to kind of keep it quiet, again, in the name of protecting the integrity of the organization. And then they kind of send them down the road. So how do we find out if something like this has happened at another organization, if there's something going on? It's the reference checks. And I did not know about RefLink, I'm ashamed to say that, until a couple of weeks ago when Mike and I were talking. And I understand that you can get these references submitted when somebody doesn't have to put their name on it. That's a game changer, because there are a lot of people who are like, well, I don't want them to know it was me, but it's not my business. And then they just don't do it. Well, you've got this tool now where you can do it, and people will much more likely to tell the truth about what they know. And that is just absolutely huge. And then once they've been vetted, they have to be trained in a multitude of topics, including red flags and grooming. And just remembering that this is not a one and done. It has to be ongoing. And then of course, the policies and procedures, I can't begin to talk about the importance of that, because just as we talked about so much today, it starts at the top down. And when the leaders, you who are here today, are doing what they're supposed to be doing, then everybody else will be doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if anybody has a question, they can fall back on those policies and procedures. Well, I can't remember exactly what I was supposed to do. Go back and read it. And if you have a question, open door policy, come in, let's talk about it. And I think that's how you establish the foundation to be able to build that culture of prevention.
Yeah, as we start to wrap up, I'm going to go through a couple of questions. I'm going to throw one out to you. We got a couple of questions that I'll throw, but I got to get those together. But before we do that, I've heard Joelle and Mike speak to this, but as somebody that's leading children's ministry at a church, share with them that this is preventable. Like, because you all are both advocates of like, hey, we can set a high bar and we can prevent this from happening to the children that walk into this ministry that you are overseeing. I'll just stop there. Both of y'all are passionate about this. Whoever wants to jump in first probably will be Joelle, and then Mike may not get a voice, but we'll let him anyway a little bit. But
you told me to jump in first. That's
I did. Go
first. I really think that if we all come from the point of view that preventing child sexual abuse and creating awareness about child sexual abuse and empowering children against child sexual abuse has nothing to do with sex. It has nothing to do with shame. It has nothing to do with it. And we're talking about a crime and body boundaries and simple procedures and policies that people can enact and follow to empower people to come from a place of information as opposed to a place of fear, because fear never saved a child. And so if we really look at child sexual abuse is a crime of shame and secrecy. If we take those out and we make this about safety and we make this about awareness, that's how we can really start that foundation. And if you come from that mindset and build that foundation, then all of your policies and procedures come from a place of we speak openly. We empower people. We do not live in fear, and our children are safe.
Very good. Mike, you got a follow up to that, or?
Yeah. So I guess the thoughts I'm having is we've got proven models, and we've seen it work in domestic violence starting, 30 years ago when I started in Nashville. We've seen this work all over the United States. I'm frustrated because we've seen models where it works in our public and private schools, but yet when we see these mass events like we saw recently in Uvalde, Texas, we start to see all the red flags, all the signs, all the history, all the behaviors. Criminal behavior is actually quite predictable most of the time. That seems like an odd statement to make. And I know there's one question that came up in the chat, like if we were going to talk about active shooter, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time here, but we talk about with church safety and organizational safety zones, outer zones, parking areas, inner zones, and then the closer we get, like, to the children or to a pastor, what we're doing in these different zones and who's allowed into these zones and how well we know them. What are the behaviors? There's so much predictability if I understand child sex abuse, domestic violence, active shooter. So much of this, there are signs and symptoms that exist if we just recognize, this situational awareness is what a lot of times we're missing. For example, when I go into any location, my wife was a police officer for 20 years. We go into a restaurant, we're arm wrestling over the seat that faces the door, right? Like we are situationally aware, and then we have to argue over who gets to be more aware. I don't walk into church that I don't know where the exits are, how I can get my family out of there. I hate that I even have to say that, but I sit down every Sunday morning. I bet 99% of the people sitting around me have no idea where an exit door is at, whether or not they have to roll a window open. They're just not, it's that awareness. And so it doesn't matter if we're talking active shooter, child abuse, domestic violence. These are predictable behaviors. And once we start to understand what these red flags and signs are, that's when we start to move to this culture of prevention, because I see something that's an anomaly, it's out of place, and I deal with that behavior before it becomes something else.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I've got a couple questions that have come in, and then we'll just wrap up here. One of the questions says, how do we get men in the church to participate in these conversations? For the four of us, we know the statistics of perpetrators and men against women, and how the percentage is so much higher that males are the perpetrators of this abuse. And then what would be the impact if you were able to get 100% of your volunteers trained and in understanding grooming and understanding why policies need and standard of care are in place and why they need to be followed? Anybody want to jump in and answer that question?
I'll jump as a man and say that we shouldn't be shaming men not to be involved. And I think too often what has happened in the past is there's been a lot of finger pointing. And so it puts men in a defensive position. Most police officers that I went in and trained, they came in like this because there was an expectation that I was going to come in and do this, but I didn't. I came in and embraced them. And when you start to embrace and partner, then it takes away the defensiveness, because men's voice is important in this. Because if we're talking about child sex abuse, we're talking 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. This is not a crime that is just perpetrated against girls or women. And so, not shaming men. And I think too often there's been a bit too much shaming in the past. And that's why so many men have kind of crossed their arms and taken a step back from this.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for sharing. Okay, there's one question that just deals with policies. Let's just take this. This church has a building a culture of prevention, and what have you seen in best practices of policies on how they're trained to, or maybe a policy you say, hey, you need to consider this one for your organization to make it even better. Let's say your organization's a 7 and you want to get it to an 8 in prevention. Is there anything there that you want to speak into?
I can comment on this one. I would say, first of all, having the written, not just having a group session one day and being like, okay, this is how we're going to do things, because everyone walks out of the room and it's gone. But having it written, having the 2-on-1 rule that you talked about earlier, Donna, is an important one, I think. So you have to have rules pertaining to how many adults in the room with how many children. That's necessary, in my opinion. You have to have training on the red flags and the grooming behaviors. We do one called, what does a child molester look like? And that's the first question in the class. And everyone's like, You're like, it's not, I mean, it might be a creepy guy, but it really might not be. In fact, it probably isn't. Because again, just like Joelle was talking with those grooming behaviors, they groom all of us and not just the child. So it has to be written policies and protocols about your training, about how the staff and the volunteers, especially volunteers, we haven't talked too much about the importance of that, because I think a lot of times the employees aren't getting the requisite training, let alone the volunteers. And as we all know, in any nonprofit organization, the volunteers are the lifeblood of the organization, but they're also oftentimes the ones that are more likely to have the access and maybe more likely to be the ones who are abusing. And if we don't have those things in place for them, as well as the employees, you're still going to pay the consequences for that, both legally and morally probably. But so having those rules in place, and we have some of those types of materials, and I think Mike can speak more to that about what our future looks like in terms of getting these things out to ministries. But also ongoing training has to be an important policy that's in place as well. Again, and Don and I have talked about this a ton, how, you know, there's turnover and things happen, and you got to make sure that these policies survive even with a new administration. So those, and I can't forget this, react appropriately. When it does come to light that something has happened, do the right thing, because what's interesting is if you do the right thing, it's actually what's going to protect you from more liability in terms of litigation down the road. And we spell those things out for you. You know, be survivor centric, start with believing, and get the requisite amount of information, and then turn it over to the authorities 100% all of the time. Not only should you do that, you're actually legally required to in Indiana. Every single one of us in Indiana is a mandatory reporter, and the national trend is for that to happen in most states. So most people just think that if you're not in any kind of position of authority that you don't have to do that. That's wrong. In fact, if you even suspect it in Indiana, you're supposed to turn it in. So it's all of these things that we've been saying today. And I'm sure that everybody's like, okay, you said that like 16 times now, it's the same things, but it really is the importance of that, and putting all of that down into those written guidelines and making sure, as Joelle said, that you actually follow it. And it's not just an empty piece of paper that doesn't really mean anything.
This can all seem really overwhelming because we're talking about so many things you can do and everything. But the nice thing is that there already, as Mike said, there are already best practices out there. And there are people like us and other organizations that can help guide you through this process. You never have to feel like you are alone, and you never want to be alone as you put together these policies, because you always have something very, very important to learn from those who have developed best practices, from those who have been through it before, from people who represent survivors, from former law enforcement. So while this can seem overwhelming, it's very, very doable, because so many of us care enough about kids that we're trying to make it as easy as possible to keep kids as safe as possible.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I would say there was one question, and I'm going to answer the question. If I answer it wrong, y'all can correct me. But it said, like, what is a policy bender? Like, what is a policy no-no? And I would say this. An organization that doesn't even train on their policies, or their volunteers don't know policies, and you have so many policies that they could never remember them, right? So my counsel would be, there are some established policies that must exist, and you have to make them memorable. Joelle does a good job, even to the point of going, make them memorable to the parents that are outside your walls. So when they bring their children in, they know, hey, this is how they're going to treat my child. This is what we have. We have these ratios. We have these 5 policies that we want you to know, so that they get their eyes on it too. And she's helped me with camps to kind of say, hey, meet them at the gate and get outside the gate so that parents know, okay, this is good touch. This is what they want to do in regards to ratios, things like that. So I want to also, as we end our time together, thank each panelist for coming on and speaking and encouraging churches just to have a culture of prevention. We have many resources here at Safe Ministry. You can find those resources on our website at safehiringsolutions.com, Safe Ministry. If you just Google Safe Ministry Solutions, it will come up. We have a training that can get to all your volunteers on sexual abuse prevention in organizations just like you. It is fabulous. It rolled out in October. Joelle is one of our national trainers. We have a pastor that's in on 2 of them. We have a forensic interview. It's all boots on the ground. What makes our training different? It's all just like you're seeing here, boots on the ground, people that are doing the training are living it out on a daily basis. So it's enough of a commercial there. We thank you. We thank you for joining us on this webinar, Preventing a Culture so that children can thrive, so that you can stay on mission. And we will, we just thank you. We'll be offering these more and more, and you're welcome. I do want to say this for those that are in the Indianapolis area. We are having a live event September 22nd. I think it was up when you came in and looked. That's going to be at New Hope Christian Church in Whitestown. Joelle is going to be joining us. Everybody on this panel will be there, along with some other security experts and some church in the Indy area. And so that's on September 22nd, coming up this fall for a 1-day that you could bring your security, safety people. You could bring a children's person because there's going to be a track for children and keeping kids safe. So we thank you very much. And that is the end of our webinar. Have a great day.